women, they have a bit of a curve. So they're first protected against inflammation if you compare them to men. So they move more slowly from an inflammation perspective. And then you have this rapid acceleration, perimenopause to menopause. So when estrogen starts to drop in perimenopause to menopause, we see an average of 10 years acceleration in your GlycanAge. And for some women, this could happen across 2 years. For some women, that can happen across 10 years.
Nikolina, firstly, welcome to the podcast. I've been having done a GlycanAge test myself a couple of times now. I'm really, really excited to interview you and share all of your work with my audience. So firstly, welcome.
Thank you, Angela. I think I remember meeting you a long, long time ago. But yeah, I think that was just around the COVID times.
Yeah, a long time ago. It was great to see you again. I think the best place to start, because so many people are interested now, they're, gaining an understanding that we don't age on a linear process and that we have our chronological age, which is, marked by the date that we were born, but we can really powerfully influence the rate at which our biology is aging. You look at it from the glycans perspective. Can you first explain what exactly are glycans and how are they influencing our biological aging?
So let's start from the basics. Glycans are complex sugars. But then whenever we say sugars, people get confused and they think about diabetes, or they think about a process called glycation, which is this random damage of glucose to your proteins. What we actually measure is glycosylation, a little bit of a naming, a little bit of a tongue fold. Most of our molecules have glycans as a component, so all cells are coated in these complex sugars, and it's what we evolved to be multicellular, so our biology to communicate at the multicell level. So maybe the first time we learned about glycans was 150 years ago, when we understood that your blood groups are defined by these complex sugars on blood cells. So glycans will give you a blood group. But any process you look at on a multi-cell level, from conception to cancer biology to immune communication, all of it is mediated for glycans. And we focus on them. We focus on the immune system. So we look at your adaptive immune system, specifically your antibodies or your antibody glycan. And there, the glycans, they're post-translational modifications. So they would change function of your molecules beyond the genetics and the epigenetics. So they're a really nice way for us to understand what's happening with your biology through time, incorporating both the genetic background, the epigenetic changes through time, so all the way from when you were in your mother's womb to today, and then the environmental impact over the last couple of months. So they're what we evolved to change our function without having to turn genes on and off. Glycans would change function of our molecules real time. And on antibodies, they activate or suppress inflammation. And then what happens with aging, our immune system would lose this capacity to regulate inflammation that glycans would control. And you accumulate this background level of inflammation, or something called inflammation. And it doesn't happen in a linear way. You can have it accumulate gradually through life, or you can have a really stressful year that causes a lot of damage that then accumulates, or you manage to repair. So it's continuous damage to your immune system through time that eventually would lead to it malfunctioning in a whole range of ways. But when you look at the disease burden, majority of chronic disease goes back to chronic inflammation. And that's from cardiometabolic problems to autoimmune to cancer to how efficiently we fight infections. So most of the disease burden links back to this one system, which is the aging immune system.
So when we're looking at glycans, then we're essentially testing how well the immune system is functioning and how it's aging effectively. So we don't have as strong a defense if it's aging too quickly. And that's through this inflammaging, right? Which is one of the hallmarks of aging, which is what inflammation of the immune system.
Yes, correct. It's something we call sterile systemic inflammation. So it's not acute inflammation. We wouldn't be measuring acute inflammatory markers. It's more this background, low-grade, slow accumulation or loss of capacity to regulate inflammation, because you need a strong response for cancer, for an infectious cause, but then you also need to be able to downregulate the inflammation as soon as possible, so you don't damage yourself in the process, or you create minimum damage. And that's what we will be measuring with the glycans. You need both. You need the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory structures to both make a healthy immune system. It's this balance that would shift for life, and that we can control with lifestyle and with some pharmacology as well.
And I think that's what's interesting for me, is that, you know, you can get very real recommendations on how you might change things. It's very practical. How would you, there's quite a few different biological age tests on the market. There's telomere testing, which has traditionally now looked a little bit inaccurate. There's methylation tests, which I hear from many kind of doctors that maybe there's quite a bit of background noise with it. For someone listening to this, how would you just explain the differences and the accuracy of looking at something like glycans?
So let's start with telomeres, or theories of aging. So telomeres were this first theory we had on measuring aging. And then we understood that telomeres are great for measuring aging of a single cell, but because we have trillions of cells, they're more cell level aging, they're not system level aging. So there wouldn't be a reliable age clock to predict outcomes on a systemic level. Then about 15 years ago, the first papers on systemic aging came out, which were epigenetics and glycans. And my dad published the first glycan paper in the space about 15 years ago. And he told me, I was 19 at the time, he told me that he can measure aging on a molecular level by looking at glycans. And these are system level aging clocks. And actually, everybody buys into their theory. So there are two competing theories. And Steve Horvath, who published the first epigenetic clock, his focuses this kind of aging program. Or can we reprogramming? Can we do reprogramming therapy and reset our biology to maybe double lifespan and so forth? And our theory is more damage. There's damage to your immune system through time. So program versus accumulation of damage. And actually both might be true. Because what's very interesting in the epigenetic side is you have a maximum lifespan in every species. So by looking at epigenetics, you can measure this maximum lifespan from humans to rats to all kinds of exotic animals. So there is a program. There's something there which kind of limits us as a species. But the problem is a lot of us don't get to that limit, because our lifespan will be from 35 to 122. That's the maximum we've seen in people. So where on average we'll be 70s, 80s, but actually getting to this maximum one is hard, because we die from a lot of different diseases before that time. So we believe our side of the damage is more related to this disease burden than the maximum lifespan, and you will need both if you're going to double lifespan. So that's the aging side, that's the aging theory side. Measurement is a completely different thing. So what both epigenetics and glycomics have done is shown that on a cohort level, you can predict mortality and morbidity, so death and disease, by measuring these clocks in research cohorts. Where epigenetics struggle and where glycans have taken a lead is showing this on the level of an individual. So we've shown in longitudinal twin studies that if you have acceleration in GlycanAge as an individual, this is predictive of outcome, mortality and morbidity. We haven't seen this from epigenetics yet, because there is predominantly a measurement error. And all of the companies doing analysis, they use this Illumina array, which was really designed for research. So the measurement error is about 10%. So when you apply to an individual, when you apply it to cohort research, in a research setting, it's great. It's a brilliant tool. But when you apply it to an individual, this variability of a result the measurement error is too high. So there's one of our clients who did an experiment. They're doing a large multi-omics study, and they sent us and an epigenetic company 200 samples. And in some of them, it was an individual who was tested 30 times in 5 days. And their epigenetic age was 5 to 10 years up or down daily, based on measurement error. Their GlycanAge was exactly the same, with a maximum 1 year error margin there. So this measurement error advantage, it's something we really see strongly with Glycans because of the tools we use in the lab and because of how far we develop this analytical precision, which then helps us bring this to a level of individual and make sure that we're measuring something relevant that's going to hopefully help you improve a long-term outcome.
Which is super accurate from what you're saying because of how many tests, right? Which is interesting because, you know, what everyone's seeing on social is this competition that's going on in the Rejuvenation Olympics, you know, primarily led initially by Brian Johnson, and all of these supplements that are being taken and marketed, and different forms of hormetic stress, and with the idea of making you more resilient. But actually, I guess that's a second question as to whether those things are really going to help. The first thing is you may be testing, and that leaderboard requires, I think it must be quarterly testing or something, but those could be wildly inaccurate because even when you're testing within a few days, you can get 5 to 10 year variances. There's a lot of noise.
Correct. So I think with some companies, the minimum error they bring it down to is about 4 years or 3.5. So there's a lot of marketing noise in this space, particularly. And of course, with I don't want to go into the whole supplement debate, but it's very hard to cut through marketing versus actual science and potentially clinical applications.
Yeah, very hard. So when we're looking at this, I guess the next question someone might have, and I definitely always, whenever I've done a GlycanAge test, I feel a little bit nervous of the results, but then I remind myself that this is very practical and we're going to go into the lifestyle considerations. It gives me information, which I use alongside other kind of labs and things that I do to change my lifestyle and adapt because we can see change. What would you say to someone who might feel nervous about doing a test like this?
I always say that bad news is also good news if you're looking at the glycan perspective, because we would see these different glycosylation patterns change up to 10 years prior to symptoms and a diagnosis. And this is from some autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis to Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. It's really preempting a problem before it is a problem. And then it would respond to lifestyle and to different interventions. For example, the glycan profiles that predict cardiovascular events, heart attack or stroke. This pattern changes 8.3 years prior to an event. And this is within the study setting we had. So it might be even earlier if measured younger. And that's modifiable with exercise and with some therapeutics as well. And then the profile then would be predictive of insulin resistance. We see this glycosylation pattern change 7 years ahead of a clinical biomarker telling you have insulin resistance. That responds to weight loss. And potentially also we have some early data on the weight loss drugs. So if you do have a result that you don't like, it's highly modifiable. And the risk factors that do come up, they're highly modifiable. It's not bad news. You're not getting a diagnosis. You're heading towards a problem. Potentially, it's a risk factor. Doesn't mean everybody's going to get it. It just means you're carrying risk. But you're aware of it at the point that you can really do something about it. And that's the difference. That's why bad news is not bad news.
It's not bad news. Yeah. I mean, that's really powerful. So even with something like insulin resistance, would you see that on a GlycanAge test? Would you see that ahead of even fasting insulin increasing, for example?
Yeah, that's what was measured in the trial. So this was 7 years ahead of a diagnosis with fasting insulin. It's actually one of the bigger, when we have an acceleration and you're looking what is predictive if you have an accelerated GlycanAge, highly predictive of diabetes, dementias, general mortality risk, and many things that we still need to. We're in the early stage of collecting data for.
Really interesting. So it is very preventative in nature. Yeah, which is very reassuring. I wanted to kind of approach that up front. We're going to share some of my results because I think it's going to be very interesting for people listening in a moment. The other thing I'd really like to look at first is the link between the way people age from a GlycanAge perspective, women in particular, looking at that, and the link with perimenopause, which is where I'm at, because this is where you and I were talking about, we see an increase, an acceleration of aging. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah. So whenever we look at men and women, and actually by looking at your glycan, we can 100% detect gender. And you can, of course, change gender, but this is related to hormones. And what we see with men is they move in a linear way. So they just slowly accumulate these more pro-inflammatory and healthy glycans, lose the unhealthy ones, and it's really a linear line. Women, they have a bit of a curve. So they're first protected against inflammation if you compare them to men. So they move more slowly from an inflammation perspective. And then you have this rapid acceleration, perimenopause to menopause. So when estrogen starts to drop in perimenopause to menopause, we see an average of 10 years acceleration in your GlycanAge. And for some women, this could happen across 2 years. For some women, that can happen across 10 years. And another place we see it is post-pregnancy. So again, as your hormones drop post-pregnancy, you see about a 10-year increase in your GlycanAge, which then goes down back to your baseline when your hormones stabilize. So usually when you stop breastfeeding. So there's a big hormone connection, and we understand it more and more. So we've learned that certain types of glycans, particularly we call it glycan mature in the report, or these pro-inflammatory structures, are regulated by estrogen, both in men and women. And as estrogen drops, you see this shift. With men, it's also estrogen. So men actually have more estrogen than women post-menopause if they don't replace estrogen. So that's usually
I
how
read
a
that. It's super
clinician...
interesting. Yeah. And
It
that's
is.
what's linked right to the higher risk of cardiovascular disease and dementia. It was really interesting when I saw that.
And most chronic disease in women happens post-menopause. So their risk overall of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all age-related happens post-menopause. For men, it happens a bit earlier. And of course, we're still trying to understand why. But if you give men back testosterone, it's only positive if you don't block the conversion to estrogen. So if you don't use aromatase inhibitors, or you drop their conversion to estrogen. So we see that the benefit for men of testosterone is actually estrogen, or its conversion to estrogen. And if you look at the long-term data, you don't have these studies on men, because not that many men have been on testosterone for so long that we can look at the long-term outcomes. For women, we have it because it's been in practice for 50, 60 years. And you have data tracking women over this period where if they start estrogen early, so around the age of menopause, there's a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality. So if we look at the currently available longevity drugs, estrogen is number one in terms of the long-term data we have on outcomes. And it's, I think, the number one thing every woman should be looking at in that life period.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And I saw actually that you've done some studies on that, right? And how much it can reverse a woman's biological age. When we're looking at this sort of dynamic nature that you've described there, so if someone did a GlycanAge test immediately post-pregnancy, they could look a lot older, but then it returns to baseline. When we're looking at testing, how long in terms of the lifestyles you were talking about, what's been going on from birth, genetics, epigenetics, but then there's this lifestyle, what period of time is influencing that test? So if we've tested and then we want to basically implement some changes and then retest, what would be that duration?
Half-life is 21 days. So minimum period we would recommend is 6 to 8 weeks to see a change. And we can see a significant change even with lifestyle interventions like caloric restriction or fasting within an 8-week period. If you do a full fast, so not eat for a week, then we will see quicker. We can see changes within a week. But if you look at what part is genetic, we did a lot of twin studies, Twins UK predominantly, and a few Swedish twin cohorts. About 40% of your GlycanAge, so the age score, is heritage, or it's defined by your genetics. And of course, it's going to be a little bit different in each person. Might be 30% for you, might be 35, might be a little bit more or less. Then the rest is epigenetic and environmental. Epigenetic is everything that happened to your genes through history, mother's womb to now. And then lifestyle habits. And that's what we can modify with behavioral change and with drug intervention. So there's about 60% on average that you can influence with interventions when it comes to your glycan profile and your GlycanAge.
And when you're looking at that epigenetic component, you mentioned from the womb, does that go back? Like I've seen some research like talking about the fact that those epigenetic tags can be influenced by 2 generations. So it could be our grandmother. Does it go back that far?
Well, we don't know, but potentially yes, because a lot of things are, for example, trauma is you can transfer it epigenetically. So there is potentially big components there that we need to understand to get the full scope. But yes, in theory, you are getting alongside the genes you're getting from your ancestors, you're also getting their epigenetics.
Okay, but it sounds like we have a huge influence, right? 60% in terms of our ability to influence these outcomes. When you're looking at aging, I mean, like I saw sort of faster biological aging in one client who was just literally just disrupting their circadian rhythm through travel very extensively. Have you found that if you're testing people where they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, beyond, that there's a sort of average that you're finding that most people in modern, say, in modern Western world, how they're aging compared to their chronological age?
So the average came from our biobank baseline. So we accumulated this biobank of over 250,000 glycans over the last 20 years because we came out of a research institute focused on glycobiology. And there the average is the average, your age. And then you have the average bad, which is 9 years higher GlycanAge, or the average good, which is 9 years younger. Now, if you compare our biobank baseline and our consumers or commercial customers, I think we looked at it last time about a year ago. The average GlycanAge user, so the person who actually pays for it, is 7 years young. So there's a healthy user bias. The people who are already healthy, they're going to care about their health a bit more and be proactive. But of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. You have a lot of people who think they're doing healthy things, but actually they might be causing themselves harm. And we see this quite often in practice.
Especially like we were talking earlier, if there's overstress, right, or over supplementation. You mentioned fasting there. That's really interesting to me because, again, this is an area that is, I guess, a little bit controversial, right? We know that fasting stimulates, or longer fasts at least, stimulate autophagy. They help with insulin sensitivity and all these things. But then when we're also looking at female reproductive health and hormone health, women's bodies are kind of acutely sensitive. So how might that affect, if we look first at a cycling woman, there's some like minimal research, I guess, around fasting at certain times of your cycle might be better. But then we also see that, Dr. Stacey Sims has put a lot of research into this, both for pre and perimenopausal women, that actually if they're athletic, they should be feeding, and just an overnight intermittent fast is sufficient. What are you seeing from a female health perspective with glycans?
We don't have enough data on fasting, particularly not intermittent fasting. We had a small cohort of men not eating for 7 days, where we measured their GlycanAge before and after, and we saw a positive shift. Now, if you apply this to women, we don't know if we're going to see the same. And there is indication that it might actually be harmful. Well, for one, we know that for some people who have a sensitive thyroid, it would slow down their metabolism and even lead to thyroid problems or Hashimoto's. So there's, of course, a balance. And that's usually from the prolonged caloric restriction, or really pushing it to a limit. To do a metabolic reset with a 1-week fast, and again, very early stage data there, where we have a lot of data is on exercise and gender differences. So we did a lot of different sports studies, and we can see that somebody who's a professional athlete, so if you compare professional athlete to sedentary and overweight population to moderate exercisers are the youngest. So they have the youngest GlycanAge. Their sports is positively going to impact their longevity. The sedentary and overweight are equally inflamed as the professional athletes. So there is a balance there that's very easy to tip over. And although an athlete looks visually very healthy and fit, actually there's a reason why athletes have such short careers. They're considered old at 35, 40. They have a lot of the age-related diseases, particularly joint, much earlier in life. than somebody who's not a pro athlete. So there is a cost of performance or pushing yourself to a limit there, which makes sense. If this is your career, if you paid to wreck your body, but it particularly doesn't make sense if you do it alongside a stressful job and you're kind of doing it as a hobby and you're just kind of destroying yourself in the gym 2 hours per day. I think that's the area where it stops to make sense. Now, when we compare male and female athletes, male athletes are equally inflamed, as I said, to or obese. Female athletes are very pro-inflammatory. They are worse than the obese cohort. Why? Potentially hormones. So we train female athletes same as we train male athletes. And there's a missing personalization there connected to hormones that we don't fully understand yet. But if we look at women athletes, it's very often that they lose cycles. So amenorrhea is very common. If they're some competitive sports, very often to also lose bone density. So there's a lot of age mimicking symptoms that happen temporarily as they compete or they push themselves, which shouldn't be happening in a healthy individual. So there is a cost of sports to women that's higher to men. And that's probably true with fasting. That's probably true with a number of different things where we don't yet personalize for the gender differences.
Interesting, very interesting. I mean, that kind of very much ties in with when I've interviewed Dr. Stacey Sims a number of times, and she's spoken about the need to bring cortisol down post-exercise, the need to stop overstressing women too much and giving them sufficient recovery. The fact that, fasting is another stress on top of things that doesn't fit with women's hormones. And that's what you're seeing here. Yet what we see on social media, right, is always like stressing and doing things, doing more. When we look at when you talk about moderate exercise, I think this would be helpful for people to understand what would be classified, or is that going to be very individual? You and I were talking offline about the exercise that I do. Could one person tolerate? We know genetically some people recover faster. They might be eating differently. How individualized is that?
Very personalized. So any conclusion we make on the study level never perfectly aligns to an individual. So we really need to find individual biomarkers that you can measure and then make a decision, okay, this is the right amount of exercise for me, or this is the right type of lifestyle diet, so forth. So that's what we're missing, because everybody takes the scientific paper and they're like, okay, I should do 150 hours of strength training per week. But you could be tolerating more. We have professional athletes who train daily who have very low GlycanAge. It's just not the average. The average is actually higher than their age. And if you look at a study setting, again, there was a study with long-term outcomes that looked at strength training, and 90 minutes per week reduced all-cause mortality by 10 to 15%, so it was good. While doing more than 3 hours per week of strength training increased all-cause mortality by 10%. So there is a fine balance there, which you have this average, but you have to personalize it to you. So to you, it might be 5 days in the gym, and you have kind of the same good benefits of it. And for somebody else, it could be 1 day in the gym, and they already are at the limit of what they should be doing to get the long-term benefit. So I think that's personalizing sports interventions, diets. That's the next frontier we have to really go into to give that advice, because it's not going to be same you to me and somebody else. So there's no general rule that we can apply.
I guess that's where, for an individual, like in between testing, things like HRV can be a really useful metric, because if you see that suppression or that sudden drop, and there's a lot of research now, isn't there, coming out around the coefficient variation of HRV, where we're looking at what's the pattern across 7 to 10 days. Are you able to maintain a good heart rate variability for you, because it's very individualized, with that training load, with that stress in your life? Or are you seeing like a very spiky presentation? Then we know we're not managing that recovery versus the output.
Yeah, that's definitely one area to go into. And we're also looking at it from an inflammation perspective. You should not have chronic inflammation from sports. You should have acute inflammation from sports. So that acute inflammation won't be reflected in GlycanAge. Anything that that's a healthy response. You're building new muscle, so you're going to be inflamed. You're going to be in pain the next day or for a couple of days, but it shouldn't be there chronically. Your body shouldn't chronically be, fighting. It's kind of like being in a chronic infection, which is driven by your drive to build muscle quicker than your body can actually sustain.
Right, yeah, which I think is an important point actually for people to understand, is that the GlycanAge test is looking at chronic systemic long-term inflammation, not acute inflammation. And so, because I guess a question that will come up in people's mind, it came up in my mind when I was taking it, does it matter if I recently did a heavy workout or was recently sick? That's
No.
not going to affect the test?
No, you're not going to see any. So any acute, unless it's very severe. So the only time we see an effect of a severe, and that would be severe COVID or pneumonia on your GlycanAge, then you would see acceleration. But this is only if it's severe. If it's mild COVID, mild influenza, no change in your GlycanAge.
Interesting. And actually, I did concurrent bloods with mine and saw that I had a strep infection, and that wasn't reflected in the test. I just want to pause, Clementina, 1 minute, because the only reason that call came through the filter is because it's my child's school. So I'm just going to check. That's normally an emergency phone call. I'll ask you a question, shall I, then, to lead into it?
Yeah. Ask a question.
So that's super helpful, Nikolina. So when we're looking at like athletic training, we're looking at stress. This was something that was on my mind, like how much, if people have stressful jobs, how much that might be contributing to a faster biological age. You and I were talking about some interesting research that you had on this. What can you share in relation to that?
So I'll actually share a case study, and we can also then talk about research on stress. But there was this, so we work with a lot of functional medicine practitioners, and most of our testing is actually for doctors. And there was a client working with her functional medicine doctor who had an executive job, so high stress career, 2 little kids, and then she did HIIT training every evening. And now this is an example of how science doesn't always meet individual. We did a HIIT training study with men, 35-year-old men, who did sprint training as HIIT, and all of them got younger in 12 weeks. So we, in general, believe that HIIT training is good for you. But here, because you have life stress, you have work stress, and then you have physical stress every evening, it's piling stress on top of stress. So her doctor was bargaining with her. She was like, okay, look, we can't take away your kids. You want to change your job. You love your job, although it's stressful. Let's change the training. We have to train something. You're probably, and she was 15 years above her GlycanAge. So it was, she was, I think, 35 and 15 years over that. So she made her change the HIIT training for yoga every evening. So she continued to have her routine, 1 hour of exercise, but it was yoga, and measured her within 12 weeks, and her GlycanAge dropped 15 years. Wow. So she was around her age. So it's one little change, one big stress factor, huge impact on an individual. And we know that stress is we know that already being an athlete, over exercise accelerates your GlycanAge a lot. We know the menopause on average accelerates your GlycanAge by 10 years, and then you can rescue this 10 years with estrogen. But stress has even more of a profound impact. And we know that from the PTSD research that was started about 10 years ago. So somebody with a PTSD diagnosis is on average 15 years older on the GlycanAge clock. So PTSD gives you more inflammaging than menopause. So your mind gives you more inflammaging than menopause. And then now we have a few studies coming out in work stress, medical residents. We tracked a number of young doctors, and we would see incredible acceleration in their GlycanAge, lack of sleep, lack of good nutrition, lives are at risk. They've never done this job before. It's a profound effect on their GlycanAge, which is hopefully temporary, because the stress will go down. But stress is a huge factor.
That's very interesting. I mean, I suppose I feel relieved that I wasn't testing when I was a corporate lawyer, pulling off all-nighters and weekends of work, right? I guess from like as well, the research I've seen is the perception of stress, which is what you're talking about, the mental aspect, and with PTSD and things, is whether you have agency over it. For someone who loves their, like clearly this individual in the case study, she had a stressful job, she had 2 young children, she loved her job, she loved her kids. When you remove the HIIT, she was able to cope with it, especially with the yoga alongside. That perception of stress is also extremely important, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Stress is in your mind, or it's a mind response, because in animals, they're only stressed when they're running from a threat. So you're running from a lion. And then they're going to be in this chronic stress for 2 minutes. And then after that, nothing happened. Their biology is back to baseline. What happens with us, we're the only species that can create this fight or flight without actually having to run from a lion. So it's purely how we perceive it. And then if you look at all the consequences of that on our health, this is one big factor that we need to incorporate into understanding longevity, because what happens when you're in fight or flight, you don't need to fight viruses because it's supposed to be temporary. So you're going to suppress your immune system. You don't need to reproduce. So you're going to suppress your reproductive system, and you don't need to digest. So you're going to suppress your digestive system. And if all of that is suffering chronically for prolonged periods of time, that's really where you see most of the health conditions and the disease burden nowadays. And that is a stress response.
Very interesting. So I think this is probably a good place to talk a little bit about my results. So we don't have the interim data, which is a little bit frustrating. If I'd done a test, I should have done one at 48. But I think this also sheds more light right on the stress angle for our audience listening. So the first time I did the GlycanAge test, I had a biological age at 47. That was of 20. And then I recently repeated the test, the GlycanAge test, and I had a biological age of 26. So that's 2 years, but I've seen a faster rate of aging. All very good, right? Very positive that it is younger. But I think what's really interesting to me is looking at it and trying to sort of diagnose, and I did bloods alongside, is to sort of diagnose what are the changes in my lifestyle, in my stress that happened over that period. We know that I've gone deeper into perimenopause. And you've explained there around, if we deal with the hormone basis first, that taking hormones can make a difference. So we didn't get the interim. At 47, I wasn't taking any hormones. I think you were saying offline that quite possibly had we tested me at 48 and I was then in need of hormones, if they dropped a lot, we might have seen me older than 26 at that point. Is that right? Yeah. But then now I started hormone therapy last October. So we've had around 4 to 5 months of hormone therapy, and it's at 26. So that, from your research, would indicate that is playing a part, right?
So you would see as your estrogen, so where glycans fit in is you're still cycling, but your overall estrogen levels have dropped and inflammation has gone up. This particularly glycan medium, if you're looking at your report, the pro-inflammatory ones.
Okay.
And on average, you would gain 10 years in this transition, perimenopause to menopause, and you would rescue this 10 years with estrogen. So what could have happened? You might have had more of an acceleration in your GlycanAge, and then the estrogen therapy supporting that. And if you've been on it for 4 to 6 months, what we usually see is that over a year, your glycans would improve. So you would see an improvement after 2 months, after 6 months, and then you would still continue to go down within the first year. So if you measured again in a few months' time and nothing has changed in your lifestyle and your therapy is the same, if your GlycanAge drops again a few years, that could be purely estrogen related. So your therapy could be kind of slowly pushing your inflammation more down. But then there's also some lifestyle factors that you brought up that we can go over. And if you look at those key factors that influence GlycanAge, so the aging related ones, they're sometimes independent to these 2 other indexes. So we call them glycan lifestyle and glycan medium, which are more specific to certain indications. So there's one called glycan median, which is connected to cardiovascular disease. And it's actually quite heritable. So a big component is genetic, but it's also modifiable with exercise, different therapies. And then there's the lifestyle one, or this is called bisecting scientifically, that would respond to stress, sleep. So you mentioned you have a very good GlycanAge, and actually being more than 10 years younger is way better than the average. It's an excellent GlycanAge. But then you mentioned in some of those additional indexes, there was some room for improvement that you wanted to focus on.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the thing, because when you and I were talking about agency, and I think that's what's so powerful about this, because with anyone, right, we always have to consider, like, I guess, boundaries to a degree. How much stress are you willing to take on? Because it's going to affect our physiology and our health. So that's one area. The other thing I would say is post-COVID, like the longer we go post-COVID, just the busier I am with all my kids' athletic clubs, my 2 businesses that I run. I've got 3 kids, 2 dogs. There's a lot going on, the extra sort of emotional load. And I think that with a little bit less sleep, and I am like your case study, I had started to introduce, so I've always done a lot of resistance training, but I had started to introduce more high intensity interval training from the GlycanAge test. And I think this is why I was so excited to interview Nikolina, is because that, that it's not scary to get this test result. For me, it's really empowering, because I can look at it and go, actually, where can I change things to take care of my long-term health?
Yeah. And that's so there's parts of your GlycanAge which you can modify with therapies like estrogen. But then these independent factors, they wouldn't change as much with age. They'll change more with genetic baseline, so the cardio risk, the glycan median, or with habits, smoking, stress, sleep, drinking. So where it helps to a clinician or you as an individual is you can see in the profile, somebody's improving because of the estrogen therapy. But they're not doing so well because these other factors are more negative, and that's connected to something else in their life. So we had a client who improved a lot on HRT, and she had a good GlycanAge, but then she had a really poor glycan lifestyle, or the bisecting structure, and that was due to alcohol habits. So you can kind of work with a client and see some things are working really well, but there's still room for improvement. And it's still connected to risk factors, which are a little bit more independent to the core aging biology. They're more specific damage that you do with certain predisposition or with habits. So what I would suggest, because there's a lot of factors you're changing, is to measure more frequently to see, as you change vertical by vertical, what has the strongest influence. Because you might change your training and we might see a big shift, or we might not see a big shift. And the more insight you have into, so say even a couple times a year, I measure a few times a year, and I can define 1 or 2 key kind of influencers which cost 10 years acceleration or 10 years deceleration. And then I've been tracking this since I was 24, so now I'm 34, that's 10 years. I have all this data of when I'm doing damage in life and how well am I repairing it and when am I accumulating it. Because the goal is not damage is okay, you're going to have it with natural life stages like pregnancy and menopause. Stress, you can't avoid stress in life, but it's about the recovery. Can I recover from the stress or the transition I've gone through, or am I actually accumulating some of the damage that's going to cost, in 10, 20 years time, but not right now?
Yes, very interesting. And I was doing different exercise at that point. I was doing a lot more, you and I were talking offline, a lot more nature walking, right, which rebalances your system, and a lot more low level activity. I think that's the thing that's really powerful about this. For someone then looking at this, and I know that you have an exclusive discount for our listeners so that they can go, we will and try out the test. We will put a link in the show notes to that. How often should we test, and should we apply only one variable at a time in between testing?
So, well, depends on how much of what you're going through in life and how much of a biohacker you are. But ideally, you have feedback on some things you can separate. So you can say this glycan is influenced by estrogen, this is influenced by exercise, this is influenced by diet, sleep, or stress. So you can do 3 things at the same time and read it in your glycan. That's generally still okay. But if you have a good result and there's not much change happening, then once or twice a year is more than enough. Then you're kind of getting feedback on a bi-yearly or yearly basis, what's happened in the last period. And generally, you're going to be around the same. So you're going to be accumulating a year by year. So if we track people longitudinally in research, they age about a year per year. Then if you're doing more experimentation, I would say 3 months after the change, because then you get immediate feedback on if a therapy, exercise program, stress factor, whatever it is actually going to pay off in the long run. So you can adjust it in the short term, because you might be investing a lot of time, energy, money into something, and it might not. And the most famous one is the expensive supplements. We always have clients who come to us and they're like, "Oh, I tested my GlycanAge, it wasn't great, so I bought this 500-pound supplement."
In the hopes it would
And
change
I
it.
was taking it for 3 months, and then I did my GlycanAge, and it was actually older. Like, great, but you can't just fix everything with a supplement.
Are there any supplements on that? I think you've done research on NAD precursors.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can speak just a little bit to that. And also, are there any other things like the obvious ones like vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3, the kind of basics that we talk about? What have you seen with supplementation?
So a lot of time we don't see that positive of a response to the companies who do the trials, but there's not many supplement companies doing trials, number one. But when they don't see what they want to see, they don't publish, or they don't want to publish with us, so we can't tell you. But there are some companies which have great trials and which have had successful outcomes, and we saw reduction in GlycanAge. So one of them, the NAD precursors. There was a really nice placebo control crossover trial with NAD boosters, a company called Nuchido. And it was only a 1-month intervention, so it's kind of the minimum we need to see any change in your GlycanAge. And there was a 1.26 years reduction in your
Within
GlycanAge.
just a month?
So within a month, yeah.
That's
so again,
powerful.
if you compare estrogen and NAD boosters, estrogen is a lot more powerful, but there is something there that's worth exploring or worth trialing. And of course, it's never going to work for everyone, but for the majority, we will lose NAD as we age, and it does make sense to support that production. And this is actually the way they do it is a bit different to just putting raw NAD. That's and actually the founder of that company would explain this a lot better than me, so I would leave it to her. But it's repairing the way you produce NAD versus just putting raw stuff in there, which might not be as helpful. We did some
We'll
trials
link
with
to that actually. What I'll do is I'll put a link to that. We have done a podcast with Dr. Nicola Conlon, the founder of Nuchido, and talking about the salvage pathway and why it's too big a molecule, like if it's in the blood and things like that. So I'll also put a link in the show notes for our audience so they can have a look at that.
Amazing. And we did a trial with eggs fortified with omega-3, and that had a positive effect on your glycom. So NAD boosters and omega-3 are things we know. And of course, there's a lot of coincidental data from clients, but not in published trials. So there's none that we would add a stamp of. Well, in terms of a GlycanAge perspective, we still need to do a lot of research in this space.
Okay, but nothing yet on vitamin D.
So we know that we never had a trial on it. If we do, potentially there will be. Also depends on the type of vitamin D. And we know that there have been trials that didn't look at GlycanAge, but certain types of glycans, and there was a positive effect. But it's not our research; it's only like segments of the glycom. We would want to do a proper placebo control trial with different commercial providers and see who actually has the best.
And with sleep, are you seeing that as a very individual thing as well? I know we're given kind of blanket research of 7 to 8 hours. I think when I was looking at my own testing both times and going through it, they were sort of like, actually, it's quite individual how much sleep. And some people can have slightly less. They're maybe more efficient with sleep, but circadian alignment and kind of going to bed and waking up at the same time. Do you see those things factoring in?
So we're currently doing an internal study with Aura. So trying to plot that on different GlycanAges, and it would be individual for sure, and also we'd have different circadian rhythms. So for somebody it makes sense to wake up at 8, for somebody 6 a.m. is good, and it's going to be very individual. But we see that if you are diagnosed with sleep apnea, that's a study we had, you're on average about 8 years older on GlycanAge. So an official sleep disorder causes significant acceleration, and if this can be rescued, of course, that should result in improvement.
Super interesting. We will link to your website and everything about all the research so people can dive deeper. It's really, really interesting. And I think the key thing here is just one of the biggest takeaways for me is how far ahead you're able to look, up to 10 years. Even when we were talking about something, a lot of people say, I'll track my HbA1c with the glucose, and then one step better is I'll look at my fasting insulin. You're able to even see that kind of 10 years ahead. I mean, that's just so powerful for people who really want to take charge of their health. And it's not an expensive test to do, but it's very powerful, and you give a full consultation, which I personally found really, really helpful to go through. I think we're also going to link to a second video for people who want to go deeper, just having a look at my results as well. So we'll put that in the show notes with one of your scientists and advisors. We'll also include that link, glycanage.com/Angela, so listeners can get an exclusive discount. Is there anything else, Nikolina, that you want to share, or how can we keep up with the wonderful research that you're doing? Because that's the thing, you've done and continue to do so much research in this area.
Yeah, well, you can follow our chief scientist on LinkedIn. He's very public. He publishes every paper on LinkedIn. He's called Gordon Lauc. He's my dad.
Okay.
And then, we have a nice newsletter. We're quite active on social media. And there's a link between the Research Institute and how we productize that for time. So the Institute is independent. We have 60 scientists working full time. And we publish 30 to 40 papers a year. Sometimes in different, from brain, I can't even pronounce glyconeurobiology to cancer research, to all kinds of different areas, and of course aging as the main pillar. So I think tracking what our marketing team is doing, we're going to always give a good update, and as soon as we can add something to the product, we add it to the product. But everything we claim in the report is coming from our published research. If we, for example, the fasting study, not publish it, not add it to the report. When we publish it and we know that it's science, then we add it in and we reference it, and of course we explain that not everything will fit the individual.
I think that's what's so powerful, all the science and also the case studies that you do. I know you run webinars with functional medicine doctors and things like that. Super, super helpful. I think I'm on one with you guys actually next week. So really, really interesting. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. You really are just helping really empower people, right, to take charge of their health, which I think is the most important thing. Without that, we don't have anything. So thank you, Nikolina, and thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.